is we call it a drive-in. It's so you are at your convenience, sitting where you need to sit, and you can still see what's going on and hear what's going on. Um, we're going to just talk some basic information about accommodations. I'm Melissa Murphy. I'm a special ed coordinator with Hall County.
And we appreciate you joining us at the end of a school day. My name's Stacy Wagner, and I'm the district testing coordinator. And we're going to kind of tag team this because we have some test coordinators who are joining us today and some special education friends who are also joining us.
And we also have Karen Scott with us because we do go over some GAA stuff, and that way if you have any questions on GAA, you can jump in and ask her since we've drug her in here with us.
Although I will go ahead and throw out that we will be doing some GAA training this fall in the next couple of months, just kind of in preparation for long before the window opens, now that we have a little bit of a frame of reference for what that new assessment's going to be.
All right, the first thing we want to talk about is what an accommodation is. Stacey had this picture on a PowerPoint that she had, and we just thought it was the most appropriate way to explain it. It doesn't give anybody anything more than what anybody else has, but it does give them access to what other people have. Some people have to go up the steps and some people have to go up the ramp, but you're still getting in the same place. And if we didn't have the ramp, we'd have some people that couldn't get there. So it's not giving somebody an extra boost of accessibility. It is just
yes.
Okay. So we're gonna go ahead.
Those definitions, all that text that you don't have to go back, Melissa, all that text that was on that page, that's straight from the Student Assessment Handbook. So you can read that at your own leisure. We're not going to insult your intelligence.
You're hilarious.
Accommodations fall into four general categories, four general headings. If this isn't your first rodeo, then this isn't anything new to you. Setting, presentation, response, and scheduling. Those are the general categories that have to be reported to the state. A student had some type of setting accommodation, or this student had some type of response accommodation. But then you in the IEP or in a TPC plan would give the specific type of response or presentation or setting accommodation that the student needed in order to give them equitable access.
How do you know what accommodations are allowed? There are two different charts. One of them, and we'll call it the blue chart, and this is just the header part of it. It's the allowable accommodations for students with disabilities. And the other chart that looks very similar to this is called It's
the accommodations chart for EL students, for our second language learners. Most of the folks in this room, you are special education folks, so when you are working on the accommodations that you're putting into an IEP, it has to come from, or into a 504, I'll throw that out there too, an IEP or an IEP. Those accommodations come from this blue chart because it is specific to students who have disabilities. The accommodations for a student who is an English language learner from the yellow chart go in the TPC plan. And so your test coordinators, you've seen sort of both of these. The accommodations that are in this accommodations chart are the ones that are the most frequently used in the state of Georgia. And they are the ones that are like pre-approved. They're the pre-approved ones. You can ask for accommodations that aren't listed on this accommodations chart. Those would be very rare, in the very rare circumstance that you have a student who needs something that's not on this chart. But it's a process. It requires approval by Dr. Swafford, the special education director, and then it goes through my office, the testing coordinator, and I have to submit it to the DOE for special approval. It takes at least 6 weeks before that approval comes back. But in my time as a school test coordinator, and then of course I'm pretty new to the district test coordinator, I don't remember that having happened at all. So for the most part, the accommodations that the state has on this allowable accommodations charts are the ones that you will probably need and use.
And where can you find these allowable accommodations for the special ed? You can go to the special ed website, And also in the special ed documents, you can go under new documents and create custom form, and we try to keep the newest one in that section also.
Yeah, so this accommodations chart is only 1 or 2 pages out of those bigger documents, the student assessment handbook and the accessibility and accommodations manual. Both of those have been updated this year with a number of changes. For our test coordinators, those are located in your test coordinators Canvas course for easy access, but Melissa links them for you for our SPED friends on your site as well.
And this is what the whole chart looks like. We wanted y'all just to kind of see. We talked about the different areas before. We've got them starred in red. The setting accommodations, there's a list of the approved setting accommodations approved by the state. Then you go out to the side and say, which test am I talking about? I'm talking about the milestones. Then I can see that special ed classroom is standard for the Georgia milestones test. If you go to the access test and you're looking at the setting accommodations, you see every one of those say have an A, which means they are allowable. They're allowable for all eligible students. You want to speak to that?
And well, I just want to say, I know that this isn't new stuff for some of you guys, but this was a great opportunity for us to just kind of get a clear message out to everybody. There are some things that are on this chart and that are, you know, a part of choosing the accommodations that are a little bit new, and so we're covering and making sure that everybody's starting from the same place with new test coordinators, new friends in the SPED department, along with those of you who have been here before and are familiar with this chart. So that those are allowable for everyone. On Access for ELL, on GAA 2.0, every student, that's what the A means. Every student is can be tested in a special education classroom. Every student can have special or adapted lighting. Every student can have a small group. That's not something that has to be spelled out necessarily in their individualized education plan in order for them to receive that specific accommodation. That's what the A is. And the S is for the standards. If Melissa can go on to the next slide. The S is for a standard accommodations. We'll come back to it so you can see it again. S means it's a standard accommodations. That means it's doesn't change by allowing the student this accessibility accommodation, this standard accommodation. It doesn't really change the way that you interpret the scores. But a conditional accommodation, on the other hand, does change the way that scores are interpreted. And there are only 2, I believe, conditional accommodations that are allowed, and that is the reading aloud of a passage on an English language arts assessment and the use of a calculator in grades 3 through 5, because calculators are not allowed on a 3 through 5 math assessment. So the use of a calculator in 3 through 5 and the reading of the passages are conditional. You guys who've been around the block, you know this, right? But here's why that is conditional. If, I think using sign language on a passage is also, using sign language on an ELA passage is also, but using sign language is basically reading the passage to them. If you're signing the passage to them, that's basically reading the passage. But think about it this way. If you are reading a passage to someone and then they're asked to answer reading comprehension questions about that passage, it's no longer reading comprehension questions. It has now become listening comprehension questions. And I use my own child as an example for this. He is 5, just started kindergarten. He's reading level A books. I could read him a small chapter book, a Magic Tree House, and he's going to comprehend and be able to answer some comprehension questions, listening comprehension questions, off of that very high or much higher than what he can read text. But if I were to put that Magic Tree House book in his lap and ask him to read it and answer comprehension questions, he could not do that. So a conditional accommodation is changing how you interpret those scores. That's why we use it with great caution and with care. And they have given very specific, very, very specific directions on when those conditional accommodations can be used and when they cannot.
We kind of already went over that in the last slide. The footnotes here explains what conditional accommodation and the specifics of any of those. Like this conditional says conditional 1, so you would go to that one, restricted to eligible students. Yeah, well, it just says that eligible students, you have to keep going to the next page for the guidance, the specific guidance on it. Those footnotes actually attach to some standard and some conditionals. They just give you some additional information about whatever letter is next to it over there.
So if you choose one, here's what we suggested to the folks on Tuesday. This chart right here, you need to print out a copy of this chart, and you need to have it with you at every IEP meeting. Don't trust the drop down in Infinite Campus, because the drop down in Infinite Campus is generated. We take this chart to the people downstairs in information technology and say, can you make Infinite Campus match this chart? But this chart gets changed. It was changed last year to add those GAA ones. It's changed every year a little bit, and it takes a little bit of lag time for us to get the chart, to get it downstairs to the folks in IT, to get them to change it. So the chart is what you go off of when you are choosing the accommodations to go into the IEP. And if the drop down in Infinite Campus isn't matching the chart, then you need to reach out to Melissa, and she can get that fixed for you by the folks who are downstairs.
Because I'll go ahead and tell you, I have not got to the place where I can get it fixed yet. And that's not technology's issue, that's mine. I just haven't got to, because I have to compare one-to-one what's in Infinite Campus and what's on this chart and see what's changed.
Yeah, Infinite Campus doesn't drive the decision making. The chart.
Yep, the chart does.
The chart would drive that.
Okay, which tests are allowable for accommodations? Those are really across the top of the chart. You'll see right here. The GAA 2.0, the access for ELLs is on there. The alternate access is a test that you have to be a GAA kid to be on alternate access. G Kids, Georgia Milestones, and then the NAEP, which is only on, 2 different grade levels?
So the NAEP assessment, I think, is 3 different grade levels. We don't have anyone in Hall County taking the NAEP this year, but that changes from year to year, because we did have, I think, 3 buildings that tested last school year on the National Assessment of Educational Progress, and those are just randomly chosen by the state. We never know from year to year whether or not one of our schools will be chosen. So you need to think going into an IEP, and with that chart in front of you, look at the allowable accommodations for NAEP, and they need to be in the IEP, because if your school were to randomly get chosen next year, then you would want your students to have those accommodations listed in their IEP. I believe it's grade 4, grade 8. I tested my knowledge. It's either 11 or 12, but
I think it was 11. So how soon would they let us know that their NAEP is choosing some schools?
Well, that's a great question. So I started this position in July a year ago, and the schools already knew. Okay. So I believe they were notified in April or May before I started in July. Yes. So this summer, July rolled around, and I reached out to our assistant superintendent, Kevin Bells, and was like, hey, have you heard anything about any NAEP schools for this year? And he said no. And I said, all right, well, no news is good news, I guess. Okay. And so we were free and clear this year. So you would know, but it would be not enough time to amend all the IEPs that needed to be amended, and you don't want to cross that bridge, right? Just go ahead and put it in there while you're meeting. Hold on, can we go back to that slide for just one more minute? I want to clarify from the testing side. So GAA is a specific assessment for our students with the significant cognitive disabilities. There is a specific eligibility form. You guys know this because you're the SPED friends, right? There is a specific eligibility form that has to be completed for a student to be deemed eligible for GAA. Please clarify, does a kindergarten student who may qualify for alternate access still take regular access? There is no alternate access for kindergarten. All kindergartners take a one-on-one assessment, so there is not a version of alternate access. So if you have a friend who is duly identified as SWD and EL, and that friend is in a self-contained class, they are a candidate for GAA, and they are in kindergarten, there is no need at that time to go ahead and fill out that eligibility criteria. However, the following year, when they go into first grade, if that student again, duly identified, EL and SWD, in first grade, you're like, whew, this kid is going to be is a candidate for GAA. We need this student to take the alternate version of access. Then yes, you would need to go ahead and fill out that GAA eligibility form. I know this is different than what you've ever done before. You've never wanted to fill out GAA eligibility or kind of trajectory mark a student for GAA eligibility before you get to third grade, which is the first of the GAA grades. But in order for that student, if you feel that that student is more appropriate for the alternate version of access, rather than the regular version of Access, where it's given in a one-on-one setting, and it's more appropriate language questions for a student with significant cognitive disabilities, then you would need to go ahead and complete the GAA eligibility on that eligibility form for that student.
And behavior cannot be a factor in determining GAA eligibility.
Great point. I don't know if you could hear Karen. She's sitting sort of to the side. Behavior cannot be a factor in determining GAA eligibility. It's cognitive.
It's cognitive. And a lot of our little ELL kids may exhibit some behaviors that keep them from being able to access the general curriculum, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they're appropriate for GAA. So keeping in mind behavior can't be a factor.
Yeah. I really wish I could rearrange their accommodations chart a little bit, because GAA, GKids, and Georgia Milestones are all academic-based assessments, right? Access and alternate access are language acquisition assessments. So think about it this way. If you've got a duly identified kid and they take Milestones, then they take regular access. Milestones academic equals regular access for language. If they take GAA for academics equals alternate access for language acquisition. And you will be happy to know for our self-contained friends that GKids 2.0, we've always just tried to allow some of those friends with significant cognitive disabilities to take the general ed assessment in GKids. We have very few who take GAA in kindergarten. Yep. The state is now realizing that they are going to make kind of an alternate version of GKids. It's not going to be earmarking a kid necessarily for GAA. Found this out yesterday. That they are working on taking those GKids learning progressions and extending them down into some pre-K readiness type things, so that our friends who are in those self-contained classes can be appropriate for GKids, just kind of the alternate version. So that is in the works, and hopefully will be operational for next school year.
That is good.
Yeah.
All right, you ready to go?
Yep, and I'm tired. Your turn to talk.
When you're deciding on the accommodations given must be tied to the child's disability, and it needs to be documented in the present level of performance. You cannot get on, you got a WOW adaptive GKids. You can't get on the accommodations section and give them extended time, and you have not said not a thing in the present level why that child may need extended time to do their work. Because if they need extended time to do the test, then they have to be getting extended time in the classroom throughout the year also. The Georgia polity mandates that any accommodation provided to the student must be the same for the classroom instruction, the classroom assessment, and the state assessment. And I was just kind of commenting on that in my prior comment. Some clarifications that we wanted to make was that it's for extended time for SWD. We have got information from the State Department that have talked to the lawyers, and at some point somebody had made the comment that for extended time for SWD is 1.5, and that's not so. We're being guided by the State Department through the law team that extended time for an SWD testing, it has to be decided on by the IEP team members, and it has to be documented in the plan. But
so we're gonna say in Holmes County that the default will be 1.5 if you mark extended time on there. That's what we have sort of gone with for always. But there are certain circumstances where a student needs and can use more than 1.5, like 2 times or whatever. So if it is not specified something other than 1.5, test coordinators, that's what we will go with. SPED folks, you want to have that conversation when you're in the IEP meeting, and just know that if you mark extended time and give no further clarification, it will be interpreted as 1.5. And if you want it to be something different than 1.5, then you need to specify within the IEP 2 times or whatever else it needs to be. Yes, I'm looking
Yeah,
at Melissa.
well,
Are you yes or no?
She's looking at me. I've just been told by the State Department that IEP teams have to document in the plan.
Okay.
So, but what I'm thinking is if it's not documented in the plan, we may default to that, but then we may come back and say, what did y'all decide if you got that documented somewhere?
I'll just refer back with extended time. I think we and
We'll get that
and
clarified.
well, I'm going to go in a different route here. We all are educators because we love students and we want what's best for them. And I think sometimes, and I've been at fault too, I sit in an IEP meeting and I've got this little friend that I've been working so hard with, and I want to give that kiddo every opportunity to show everybody what they know. And it's like, he'd benefit from extended time, and let's give him small group and frequent monitored breaks. And that may not necessarily be what's best for that kiddo, even though we're wanting to try and give them as much as we possibly can. Do they, back to what Melissa said, do they legitimately utilize time and a half or 2 times every time they take a classroom assessment, or most of the times that they take a classroom assessment? Do they utilize, do they get pulled to a small group every time during routine classroom assessment and classroom instruction? Do they get frequent monitored breaks? Do they take those breaks? Because if they don't take them, if they don't need them, then we don't want, I think sometimes we crutch our kids by giving them too much. And if we give a student an accommodation, read aloud is a great example. We had a number of students this past year. We gave them read aloud. The IEP team decided that they needed read aloud, and during the assessment, they pulled their earbuds out. They did not want the computer reading aloud to them. So we have to be really careful as their advocates to have these conversations, even with our students. Here's why the IEP team, here's why your parents, here's why your teachers feel like, this accommodation will benefit you. And then together you need to make some decisions as to whether or not to leave it in or not. Because if they're not frequently using them on a routine basis in classroom instruction and classroom assessment, then we need to take them out of the IEP.
You got to revisit it, yeah.
That's
right.
what I was going to say. Just because they've had it there in the past doesn't mean that it has to stay in there, particularly if they're not using it.
Yeah, if they're not using it, it goes back to the rule that it has to be used consistently across all settings. And if you've got a kid that's taking the earbuds out that won't go out to a small setting when the co-teacher is trying to take them out, and they consistently refuse that accommodation, your team's going to have to revisit that IEP to take that out and explain to the parents, look, we can't get him to use the accommodation to go to a small group. Small group for special ed is going to be comparable to maximum class size. So if you've got, and I'm going to use the EBD, the maximum class size basically for an EBD student is like 7 plus 3, so it's going to be 10. But if you've got a class and SLD kids and OHIs are in there, you may be able to go up to 14. Use that as your guideline when you're thinking about what the small group size is going to be. And then Stacey already kind of talked about the frequent monitor breaks. If you have got frequent monitor breaks worked in, and they use them throughout the year in the classroom, in the testing, and use them in the test setting, that's fine. But if the kid's not using them, then you need to not have them put in place. And I forget, what did we say about this the other day?
What do we say about what?
The frequent monitor breaks. We had a clarification we need to put on that.
I'm not sure. There was a question in the comment box about the extended time stuff applying to 504 plans as well. Yeah, it would just be best practice for 504 teams and for IEP teams to clarify what your thoughts are for extended time and what the students' needs are for extended time. Now, extended time, I do want to also put an asterisk in there. Extended time for access looks a little bit different. Okay, so the state has given us some guidance in that if you feel like a student does need extended time, and we'll come to more specifics on that guidance in a minute, but you do need to mark that extended time, but that extended time for access is limited. So when your IEP team is clarifying that maybe 2 times is appropriate for a student, just know that when it comes to access, the amount of time that they have to work on the assessment is fine to still be at 2 times. But there is an access domain called speaking, and because of the students taking that assessment on the computer, and when you mark extended time for that speaking section of access, it only gives you time and a half in that recording. And I'll clarify that a little bit more in a minute when we get to it. Small group maximum class size. Melissa covered that really well. Test coordinators, you guys give me this question all the time. Well, would 14 be a small group? Well, would 15 be a small group? It's only one other question. So the guidance that Melissa is giving about matching it to a student's eligibility area, that is our best guidance. So if you've got, 5 kids in the room, whichever one of those eligibility is the lowest, that's what we're going to go with. And SPED folks, you're going to have to help our test coordinators with this, by the way, because that is a heavy load for them to have to go back and check eligibility on every kid who's in that small group and make sure that they haven't exceeded that max class size on those for their small group. So that's going to have to be a communication issue between the 2 of you.
Yep. You talked about this a while ago. We were doing some clarification on some conditional accommodations. A non-reader, this is a question we get every year. Somebody will get in touch with us and say, well, what is a non-reader? According to the state department guidelines, a non-reader is someone that cannot decode text at any level. If a child can decode any amount, then they're considered a reader, and they cannot be given the accommodation that go for and are considered a non-reader. And you've already talked about the calculator, use of the basic calculator for milestones 3 to 5 is a conditional accommodation. And if you look, this was the conditional, right here's the conditional information.
Yeah. You just need to follow that guidance on it. As a district, we're limited to the certain percentage that we can have throughout the district on a conditional accommodation.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, we are.
But these are, and Stacy mentioned it, I think earlier, use of a conditional accommodation should be very rare. Mm-hmm. Should be few and far between. Participation in state assessments of English learners who are also SWD. When an SWD student is also an EL, there is sometimes confusion as to what accommodations are allowed. And for SWD and EL students, the allowable accommodations for students with disabilities should be used in the IEP. And when taking the access test, you use the accommodations which are marked allowed or standard. And any box grayed out is not allowed.
This little group of friends are the ones that we get the most questions about too.
Group of friends.
Yeah, so because they fall under 2 categories, and they actually fall under the allowance of 2 different sets of accommodations. Here, more than anywhere else, communication is so important. You need everybody at the table when you are making these decisions. So you've got the blue allowable accommodations for students with disabilities, and you've got the yellow allowable accommodations for our EL learners. In your IEP, you are pulling from that blue chart, but that ESOL teacher is also,
should be in the same meeting.
That ESOL teacher who needs to be in your meeting is also creating an accommodations document for these friends, but they are pulling it from the yellow. And a lot of times people are like, well, the IEP should trump. No. And sometimes they're like, well, they need to match. We need to just put in the TPC plan, whatever we put in the IEP. No. Because what you're doing is you're looking at this student through 2 different lenses. I think about my sunglasses, and I think about my little boy's sunglasses that are tinted blue, and when I put them on, everything looks blue, right? So if I'm looking at this student through my sunglasses, through the sunglasses of his disability, then the accommodations that I choose for that friend have to match and be equaling the playing field because of his disability. You are only putting into the IEP things that will help give access because of the disability. But that ESOL teacher is looking at that friend through the blue sunglasses. That ESOL teacher is looking at this friend's language acquisition, and they are looking at what accommodations does that child need because of his current level of language proficiency. And so they don't have to be exact, but everybody needs to be in the room because they can't contradict each other.
Yeah.
You can't put in the IEP, test this kid in the SPED room, and the ESOL teacher put in the TPC plan, test them in the ESOL room. Those contradict. You have to communicate, and you have to make sure that they complement one another, that you have met the student to meet the student's needs. Here's another example. On the EL chart, it gives an accessibility accommodation for using a word-to-word dictionary. That's not listed on your blue chart at all. That is an accommodation that a student who is learning the language might utilize in daily instruction and might be able to utilize as an accommodation for the test. So that's another example how your two plans don't have to be exact, but they just don't need to contradict. And the only way that's going to happen is if everybody is sitting at the table, if the ESOL teacher is in your IEP meeting, and if you are in their TPC meeting.
Yep.
Last year, right about access time, we had to go, it was crazy, and it was like a madhouse as we were amending IEPs because they had a new person who was in charge of the access test, and they decided that all of a sudden in the state of Georgia, students didn't automatically get the ability to control the audio on the access test or to repeat the audio, that was now an accommodation rather than a standard A for everyone. And so they did come back this year and give us a little bit more guidance. If the areas at the top here, those orange areas, are the broad Georgia off the blue chart areas, okay? WIDA's a national assessment, so WIDA's accommodations aren't going to perfectly mesh with the Georgia accommodations chart. But what Georgia is saying is that if you feel like a student on access would require the ability to control the audio on their own or to have the audio repeat on their own, then give them this general broad read aloud accommodation in the IEP and specify which of these other areas you feel like it needs.
And these have been added to the IEP. When
Is
you
it
go
in our
in
slide?
under,
Yeah, so
when
here
you
it
go
is.
in under access, under presentation, now you're going to see it say access, read aloud, manual control of audio. You have that as a choice now. All of these are choices. And since you can choose more than one, you choose what applies for that child.
Again, we can manipulate Infinite Campus to do what we want. We've still covered our basis with the state because they have an approved accommodation of read aloud. So we've covered our basis here by saying access read aloud. But then you have specified by repeating item audio or manually controlling audio which the team decides that they need. And we can't expect you as the special education teacher to understand everything about the access test and about whether or not a student would probably need a manual control of the audio or a repeating of the item audio. Again, another reason that ESOL teacher needs to be in the room when you're having that IEP so that ESOL teacher can be an expert about access and they can provide some context and some background knowledge as to what would be most appropriate for that friend. This non-embedded audio, a human reader, or the human reader repeating the options, this I think will be minimal in our district, though you may have someone who needs it, but this is specific to a kid who needs to be able to read the lips of someone who is talking to them. And again, we're talking about a friend who is duly identified because these are access accommodations.
Yep.
And here's the extended speaking I was telling you about. So when you mark extended time, that can mean a couple of different things. Extended over multiple days, most of our friends will not need that because these test sessions are very short, like 20 minutes, 20 to 40 minutes in length. So that's not really one that I think most of our folks would need. Extended speaking, however, if you've got a friend who's got some processing, some processing delays, and it takes them a while to think about what they're trying to say and get it out. And what happens on the speaking section is the kid will hit a record button. It'll show a picture on the screen and ask them to tell everything they see on the screen. And they hit the record button, and then they start talking. And it will allow them to talk for X amount of time, unless you have clicked the accommodation of extended speaking time, in which case it records for X and a half time. It gives them longer time to speak. And then most of these are not things that our friends will use, but they're potential. If anyone uses it, we put it in there, right? And that's what it's going to look like in Infinite Campus.
Yep. And it is already set up. Our friend Tanny Technology set that up over the last couple of days. So if you haven't already seen it, just know when you go into work on specific test accommodations under access, you will start seeing these.
And I know that you're frustrated that this wasn't ready when we started the school year. I'm frustrated that this stuff wasn't ready when we started the school year, but we were in school 3 weeks before the new student assessment handbook was delivered to us from the state. So we're catching it up as fast as we can. In the meantime, if you've already held an IEP, unless you feel like there's a need and you need to amend it, just rock on and hit these as you come to those IEP meetings, and know that we're working as fast as we can to keep you up to date.
Does anyone have any questions? Because we have gone through what we need to fill out and we need to go to, but we're more than happy to take any questions from any of you at this point.
And we kept it almost right at 30 minutes. So.
Yes, ma'am.
We were talking fast. High five.
That's right. And I thought I talked fast. Stacy's got me beat.
They say Southerners talk slow. Please. All right, well, we'll hang on here for another minute in case anybody has any questions. If you are good to go, then you can feel free to pop off. And thank you so much and have a great afternoon. Enjoy this fall weather while it lasts.